Hi friends, Miss Shannon here. It's story time. Our book today is The Giant Hug by Sandra Horning. Now let's read The Giant Hug. The Giant Hug. What do you want to send Granny for her birthday? Owen's mother asked. A giant hug, Owen replied. He opened his arms as wide as he possibly could to show how giant the hug would be. Do you want to draw a picture of you hugging Granny? His mother asked. No, Owen said. I want to send a real hug. I'll give the mailman a hug and ask him to send it to Granny. They gathered their letters and walked to the post office in town. Soon they got to the front of the lines, and Mr. Nevins called out, Next! I want to mail a hug to my Granny. Will you please send it? Owen asked in his most polite voice. Well, we don't normally send hugs, but I suppose I could give it a try, Mr. Nevins said. Owen's mother wrote down Granny's address for Mr. Nevins. Owen walked behind the counter, opened his arms as wide as he possibly could, and gave Mr. Nevins a giant hug. Please make the hug just as giant when you pass it to the mailman, Owen said. Oh, I won't see the mailman who delivers it to your Granny. I'll give the mail to Miss Porter, who sorts it and puts it on the truck to the big city. After that, it's put on a plane and flown across the country, Mr. Nevins said. Well, you will have to hug Mrs. Porter then, Owen said as Mr. Nevins carried the mail to Miss Porter. Mr. Nevins looked down awkwardly at Miss Porter as he handed her the mail and the address to Owen's Granny. He blushed and mumbled, And, there's a hug? Mr. Nevins opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Miss Porter a giant hug. Miss Porter smiled as she sorted the mail. Just then the driver came to collect the mail bound for the big city. As the driver lifted the last heavy bag of mail, Miss Porter said, Leroy, one more thing. Someone is sending a hug to his Granny. Here's the address, and here's the hug. Miss Porter opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Leroy a giant hug. Leroy laughed and said, Now, that's a piece of mail you don't see too often. Leroy whistled on the way to the big city. After unloading the mail, he checked the schedule to see who was driving the mail to the airport. It read James. Leroy found James in the break room eating his morning snack. Hi, James. I know this seems a little odd, but a hug is being sent through the mail to someone's Granny, and this is her address, Leroy said. Leroy opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave James a giant hug. James cringed. He was not the hugging type, but he would do his job. Later that afternoon, James arrived at the airport. He asked the mail handler when the mail was being loaded onto the plane. That mail was taken to the plane a few minutes ago, the mail handler said. James rushed to the plane. Where's Captain Johnson? We're getting ready to board. Captain! A kid is sending a hug through the mail to his Granny. Here's the address and here's the hug, James said with a grimace. James opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Captain Johnson a giant hug. Now isn't that a grand way to start the day? Captain Johnson bellowed. When the plane landed, Captain Johnson walked to the airport across the post office. He saw Amanda standing next to a mail truck, looking sad. Hello, are you driving the truck to the city? Captain Johnson asked. Amanda nodded glumly. A hug is being sent through the mail. Captain Johnson announced. Captain Johnson opened his arms as wide as he could and gave Amanda a giant hug. Amanda brightened and said thank you. She bobbed her head to the music as she drove. After unloading the mail, Amanda went to find Chad, the driver taking the mail to Granny's town. Chad, a hug is being sent through the mail. Here's the address, and well, here's the hug, Amanda said as her face turned red. Amanda opened her arms as wide as she could possibly and gave Chad a giant hug. Chad chuckled and said, Finally! Do you want to go dancing tonight? I'd love to, Amanda exclaimed. Chad kicked up his heels and hopped into the truck. Early the next morning, Chad drove to Granny's town. As he prepared to return to the city, he remembered the hug. Who will be delivering the mail to Penside today? Chad asked the supervisor. Shelley. But she's not here yet, Mrs. Greenberg replied as she adjusted her glasses. Please pass this on to her, said Chad. Chad opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Miss Greenberg a giant hug. Miss Greenberg gasped with surprise, and her glasses tilted to the side. Shelley, I need a word with you, said Mrs. Greenberg, calling Shelley when she arrived. A hug is being sent through the mail to a boy's granny, and you are the mail woman delivering it, Mrs. Greenberg said. Mrs. Greenberg opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Shelley a giant hug. Granny will be delighted, Shelley exclaimed. Shelley stopped to smell the flowers as she delivered the mail from door to door. She saw Granny gardening in the yard. Mrs. Lewis, I have a special delivery for you, Shelley said. Your grandson has sent you a hug. Shelley opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Granny a giant hug. Granny grinned and said, That's the most wonderful piece of mail I've ever received. You send that grandson of mine a big kiss. Granny puckered her lips and gave Shelley a big, wet kiss on the cheek. The end.